All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We will be discussing the various parts of speech in Spanish during today's webinar. Okay, my name is Dan and my colleague Zach is here to answer any questions you may have throughout or at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to send in your questions at any time. If you do need to contact us in general any day if you're working on your program, you have some options on the screen right now. If you do have any questions today, on the slide here you can see the area where you're able to send those in for Zach. He'd be happy to answer those for you, so feel free. We'll stop at certain points throughout the webinar to see if you do have any questions. Okay, in today's webinar we are going to discuss the 7 parts of speech that you see on the slide right now. We'll go into in-depth conversation on each, and there will be some practice sentences and examples throughout. Okay, so our first part of speech we're going to begin with will be a noun. And as you can see on the board, on the slide rather, all right, a person, a place, a thing, or idea. And in Spanish, nouns are classified due to gender and number. Okay, nouns can be considered masculine or feminine, and that typically has to do with their spelling. All right, more often than not, if a noun ends in O, it is considered masculine. If it ends in an A, it's considered feminine. And if you're trying to make that type of noun plural, you would just simply add the letter S. As always, in most languages, there are exceptions, and there's more to come on that. We will discuss those exceptions a little bit later in today's webinar. And another way to help identify that you do have a noun, even if you don't know the meaning of the word, if you see an article, a definite or an indefinite article, which we're going to discuss soon, typically those are going to precede a noun. So they'll be placed before it, and we'll agree in number and gender with that noun. So as I said, a noun can be preceded by or accompanied by an article, and those articles are categorized as definite or indefinite. And on your slide now you see 2 charts. On the left side you see your Spanish definite articles, 2 masculine, 2 feminine. And on the right side you'll see your indefinite articles, again 2 masculine, 2 feminine. All of the words on the left are translated as the in English. El, la, los, and las. And all on the right, if they're singular, can translate as a or an. If they're plural, some. So if you're talking about the house, if you're talking about a house, if you're talking about some houses, those articles in these 2 charts will be placed before the noun, such as house. You're going to see some examples on the next slide. Okay, so here we have some examples both with definite and indefinite articles, masculine, feminine, singular, and plural. Notice how in the first example, un means a, as does una. But as you move down the left side of that chart, el and la both mean the. In all of these examples, both singular and plural, the article and the noun are in agreement, right, in number and gender. And you notice how the definitions change on the right side. Unos and unas, plural, meaning some, and then los, definite articles, meaning the, but in a plural context. Okay, so just some examples there. As we continue forward, we will still talk about nouns and some other types of nouns. As I said earlier, some nouns are not going to end in O or A. And you see some examples on this slide. Words like hombre, meaning man, or mujer, meaning woman, and of course many others. And in this case, you're going to have to memorize the gender of these nouns, as it should say, or use context clues such as articles to help determine their gender and their meaning. So if you were to write a sentence about the man, it would have to be el hombre, since a man is masculine. If the sentence was about the woman, it would be la mujer, since a woman is feminine. And again, for indefinite context, you would use un hombre, a man, and una mujer, a woman. Okay, a little bit more about nouns. All right, some nouns are considered irregular. And in this case, the ending may appear masculine or feminine, but in fact, these nouns are irregular, meaning they require opposite articles, adjectives, etc. to agree with them. Not all that common, but some do exist, and there are about 8 examples on your slide right now. If you notice on the left side, all of these nouns that are considered masculine, they look to be feminine. They ended in A, but in fact they are considered masculine. So articles, adjectives, etc. that agree with them must also be masculine. Therefore, a word like el would precede mapa or dia, problema or tema. Little unusual, but that's why they are irregular and not regular like the ones we saw previously. And then the right side of this chart, you do have some feminine nouns, although they are masculine looking, ending in an O. Indeed, again, any article, adjective, etc. that agrees with them, relates to them, has to be indeed feminine. So, just like the other side of the chart, a little unusual, but they do exist, even though it's not very common. And these are probably 8 of the more commonly seen ones, especially throughout your program with us here at Penn Foster. Okay, some other nouns here are those that end in consonants, a non-vowel. And as you can see, the ones we've chosen here on the masculine side, they end in the consonant R, such as doctor and profesor, etc. They do have feminine counterparts. Those, however, do not end in consonants, as you can tell on the right side of this chart. Those will end in the pretty common ending, the letter A. But to make the type that is ending in a consonant plural, as you see the rule below the chart, instead of adding just an S like you would for the nouns we've discussed previously, in this context, to make doctor plural, make it from doctor to doctors, you would add the ES ending. So if you were to talk about the doctors, all males or a group of males and females, it would be los plural and doctores with an ES ending. So unlike in English, you can't just add an S to a noun that ends in a consonant. The E must be there as well. Okay, as we move forward, another type of noun, the nouns that end in the ending ISTE. Although they look feminine with that A at the end of them, they do represent both genders. A lot of these nouns have to do with sports or professions, things of that nature, professionals in a sporting context or just in an amateur as well. So if you're talking about an artist, el or la artista, the ending of artista will never be made masculine. It will never change as far as an individual is concerned. To make them plural, yes, you can add an S, but the gender, the ending at the end will not change. And a word like tenista, a tennis player. Un tenista, a male tennis player, or una tenista, a female tennis player. So just keep in mind that the ending, the A, cannot change in this type of noun. There'll be never will be such a thing as artisto or tenisto. Okay, and one of our last slides on nouns. In this case, these certain or particular endings, DAD, TAD, TUD, UMBRE, CION, and SION, any noun that has that ending or one of those endings is going to be considered feminine at all times. Okay, and again, like we did with those that ended in an R, as you see in the second note, to make this type of noun plural, again, you're going to add an ES. And for the ones that have an accent, the last 2 listed, Sion ones, the accent must be removed when making this plural, as you can see an example of that on the bottom of the screen. La canción means the song, so one song has an accent mark on the O, and multiple songs, no accent mark. Okay, not every Spanish word has an accent mark, that little dash above the vowel, in this case the O. Some do, and this is one of them. But to make that type of noun plural, the accent is removed. Since you're adding a syllable, the ES is added. And then for the one that doesn't end in a consonant, the UMBRE type, simply add an S like we have done for the non-consonant ones previously. Okay, and the last type of noun that we have today is a noun that ends in the letter Z. A noun such as lapis, a pencil. All right, again, depending on the noun, it can be either masculine or feminine. Lapis happens to be masculine. And to make this type of noun plural, there's a couple of different steps to follow here. You actually have to change the Z to a C, as you can see in the bottom example of pencils, lapises. And then, after you've changed the Z to a C, add an ES after that as the second step. Again, not too many of this type of noun, but those that do end in a Z, if you're going to make them plural, the Z has to change first to a C before you're adding the ES ending. Okay, if you have any questions for Zach, I'll take a quick moment here to allow you to send those in before we transition to our next part of speech, which we will discuss pronouns. Okay, as we move on, the next part of speech here of the 7 will be our discussion on pronouns. And a pronoun is something that replaces a noun. And there are numerous types of pronouns, as you can see on this slide. And we're going to go through each one of them and talk about them in some detail. The first type that you might be familiar with is a personal pronoun. Words that you see often, representing the subject or subjects of the sentence. And in the top chart there, you might recognize a few of those words like yo or tú or él, ella, usted, nosotros, ellos, ustedes. All right, next to them, or next to each of those, is the English equivalent. So anytime you write a sentence about yourself, like you see in that first example in the middle of the slide, if you say I speak Spanish and French, yo, I am the pronoun there to represent who that sentence is and who performs the action of that verb. All right, for those on the second level, or the one on the second level, the word familiar just has to do with your relationship with a person. If you know the person, if you're related to them, friends with them, etc. If you're speaking to them directly, you can use the word tú. However, there's another form of you in Spanish. If you look right below that, the word usted also means you, but in a formal or an unfamiliar context. Someone you don't know, someone you haven't met before, someone you're showing respect to, someone you're not friends with or related to, etc. And then Spanish also has a third form of you on the right side there on the bottom right, ustedes, and that would be used for any plural number of people. So as I am speaking to all of you, in Spanish I would use the word ustedes. And then the only other thing to really keep in mind from this chart would be that words like nosotros and ellos can also be made feminine. All right, as you can see that note right below the ellos and ellas and ustedes box, if you have a mix of people in a group, masculine and feminine, males and females, Spanish is always going to require the use of the masculine forms. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so there you have your personal pronouns. As we move on, we continue our discussion with demonstrative pronouns. Okay, a demonstrative pronoun is one that points out a specific noun based on its location in regards to or from the speaker. So distance is a key factor in this context. It plays a role in selecting the appropriate pronoun. Okay, so if you look at that chart above, all right, you see all the singular, masculine and plural, singular, feminine options. Okay, the top portion of that chart represents words like this and these. Middle and bottom represent that. If you look at those examples, this is a large house representing, this house. But as we said earlier, the word house is removed since a pronoun can replace a noun. If things are not too far away, there's not a whole lot of distance, you would use the middle options to say that house, maybe that house right across the street. We're standing only about 10 or 20 yards from it. However, if you were representing or trying to talk about something that was much further away, saying, we're currently in the United States, but we really liked that house that we stayed in Puerto Rico when we were on vacation. Now that you have quite a bit of distance between you and that house, the bottom options would be required, the words that begin with the letter A. So if that chart is a little bit unclear to you, if you're talking about something closer, go with the middle options. If you're talking about something a little bit further away, talk about that or use that bottom set. Okay, anything that's closest to the speaker, if it's in the speaker's hands, if it's on the speaker's desk, relatively close, obviously we're going to use the word this in English as opposed to that. So if somebody else has it, if it's located somewhere else, then words like ese and aquel are typically expressed. If I have it personally, if it's really close to me, then you're going to use words like este and esta. And there are some examples down below to try to help, clarify that for you. Okay, so as we move on to our next type of pronoun, we will discuss object pronouns. And before we get into the pronouns themselves, something to keep in mind that you're probably already familiar with from having learned English grammar is that there are two types of objects, both direct and indirect. And direct and indirect objects, they may be replaced by a corresponding pronoun in English and both in Spanish as well. If something is considered a direct object, or for something to be considered a direct object, it has to answer who or whom after the verb. Okay, for something to be considered an indirect object, it answers to whom or for whom. And just to clarify one thing, it looks like there's a slight typo on the direct. All right, in the direct, it should say whom or what, not who or whom. I apologize about that. So in that example below, the book answers what, okay, is being read. So the book is the direct object of that sentence. It can be replaced by a pronoun, which we're going to discuss on the next slide. And since it's being done to him, it answers to whom it's being read, he would be the indirect object in that context. Okay, so the only thing I would say to keep in mind there, slight typo, for the direct objects, it should say answer whom or what. Okay, and keep that in mind as we move forward to the next slide. Okay, on this slide here, now we will talk about the actual pronouns themselves, both direct object and indirect object pronouns. On the top left, you can see the chart of direct objects and pronouns which answer whom or what. So, for instance, if they see me down the hallway, I would be the direct object in that case. May would be the pronoun to represent me. However, if they're doing something for me or to them, then we're going to transition over to the right side, the indirect object pronouns chart. All right, if it was done for them, you would use a word like lace. Okay, so two good lists of object pronouns to be mindful of, used quite often in the Spanish language. And, even though some carry over from left to right, me and te and nos, depending on the context, they will have different uses and translations as well. Okay, as we move forward on this slide and on the next slide, we're going to talk about where object pronouns are placed in regards to a verb. And that first note, it's pretty involved, but hopefully after you, read through it and get the hang of it, it makes sense a little bit more than the initial reading of it. An object pronoun can get placed before a conjugation. Okay, a conjugation, again, just to review, is a word like lei in that first example, when the subject and verb agree. Okay, so if you notice, right, in the B example down below, the word lo takes the place of libro. Lo means it, replaces the book, as all pronouns do. They replace nouns. And based on the first part of that note, the rule is put the pronoun before the conjugation. Okay, if you happen to have an infinitive verb, one that ends in AR, ER, IR, which we didn't show on this slide, or a gerund, which we did show here, a verb that ends in that NDO, more or less, i.e. NDO or ANDO, then you can take your pronoun, lo in this case in example C, and would have to be attached to that gerund to make one word. And when that happens, an accent is required on the vowel before the N. So it's a little bit of higher level Spanish than you're probably used to, and you might be at in your program, but this will come up. It's good to keep this handy and to use it as you work through this type of material as the program progresses. Okay, so that would be the first placement rule for object pronouns, and there are a few more. Pronoun placement rule number 2 says if a sentence has both a direct and an indirect object, then the indirect always gets placed before the direct. And you can see that in the example below. All right, so when we say I read the book to him, the book gets replaced by lo. All right, that's a direct object. Lo is a direct object pronoun that relates to it. Gets to him is whom the book is read. So he is the indirect object. That's going to get replaced initially by lay if you go back to your chart on one of the previous slides. But as rule number 3 says, when both are in the same sentence and they both happen to be in third person, so one of the lo, la, los, or las, and the lay or the lace, if they happen to both be in third person, then the lay or the lace, the indirect object pronoun, gets replaced by this 6th indirect object pronoun, which is say. So that's why in that last example on the bottom, the lay is removed, the say replaces it. Again, only when both are in the same sentence and both happen to be in third person. If one of them is not in third person and the other is, then this rule is not applied. Okay, again, a little bit further advanced than you might be now if you're just starting out your course. All right, but definitely something to be mindful of as you progress, and keep handy to use to help you as the program progresses. Okay, as we move on, we're going to transition to possessive pronouns. And this is the type of pronoun that shows ownership or possession. And here, in this case, the number and the gender play a factor as well. Right? These pronouns must agree in number and gender with the noun they have replaced or that they refer to. So you can see that each of these boxes on this chart of possessive pronouns has number and gender. Number meaning they can be made plural with the S, and gender meaning they're either masculine with an O or feminine with an A. All right, and they're listed there with their English meanings as well, and a few examples down below. So that first example, this book is mine. Everything about that sentence that can have gender is masculine. The word este, the word libro, and the word mio. Since libro, the noun here is masculine and singular, mio, the possessive pronoun that represents it, is masculine and singular as well. As you change the number and the gender of the noun, as you see in the second example, the question, since novelas, novels, is a feminine and plural noun represented by the AS, then the possessive pronoun must also be feminine and plural. So, son tuyas las novelas? Are the novels yours? Everything about that sentence that can have gender is feminine and plural. And finally, one last example there, back to something that is masculine and singular. Coche, it's not obviously masculine and singular since it ends in an E, But that demonstrative before it, esse, is indeed masculine. So that's going to be your context clue that your answer should be masculine as well, if you didn't know that coche is a masculine noun just by the looks of it. And that's hard to do without having a context clue. So sometimes, that's part of learning a language, using context clues to your advantage to help you determine, as in this case, number and gender. Okay, as we move forward, our next type of pronoun is an interrogative pronoun. Think of the word interrogate. These are those that are used to ask questions. And if you notice, as they're listed there, all of them have accent marks on one of the vowels. When used to directly ask a question, or when used to imply that an answer is needed, each of them requires that written accent mark. Okay, the accent is not required when you're not looking for an answer, when you're not asking a question, as you can see in that example next to it. All right, the nosotros sabemos quiénes son. If we know who they are, all right, we're not asking who they are, we're not implying we don't know who they are. If it's factual, we do know the accent is removed. It's not needed. But in all the other examples here, you're asking a question or implying that an answer is needed. All right, so the two questions are fairly obvious, the ones that have the question marks around them. But the first example that says, I don't know where they are, if you're in need of their location, you're looking for that answer, that identification, then unlike the third example, the accent is indeed needed. So again, these might be some words you're somewhat familiar with. A word like como, a lot of people know the question, como se llama, or como está usted, por qué, asking why. Some fairly common Spanish words here, but they are indeed interrogative pronouns, and their accents marks are required when asking a question or when looking for an answer. Okay, and they do not precede nouns, they replace them, just like all pronouns do. And these are the same exact words used for interrogative adjectives. Okay, and our last type of pronoun is an indefinite pronoun. An indefinite pronoun is one that refers to one or more unspecified objects, beings, or places, and they don't indicate the exact thing to which they refer. So, I need someone, anyone, no one specific, someone unspecified, someone that's not exactly being pointed out. And you can see on your list on the left quite a few of these: something, someone, no one, nothing, everything, everyone, etc., etc. And some examples on the right, just showing their use within the context of a sentence. One thing that's quite unusual about the Spanish language, which you'll see at the very bottom of the right side here, below the last example, double negatives are indeed allowed. They are permissible and they're used in Spanish. And we know in English that they don't make any sense. So literally, that last example translates as, I don't need nothing more. Okay, but in Spanish it would translate with a more positive twist to it, since double negatives are allowed. Translates as you see in the parentheses, I don't need anything else or anything more. So even though double negatives are not allowed in English, they are quite common in the Spanish language. One of the many differences between the two languages, and something, as native English speakers, we often forget, it takes a little bit of getting used to. So something good to keep in mind there, because when you do have to write, your own English or Spanish sentences, that's something that is often forgotten. So a key point to be mindful of there. Okay, before we transition to adjectives, again, just a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to send those in to Zach at any time. If not, we'll move on here in a moment. All right, as we transition, All right, our next part of speech, as you can see, is going to be the adjective. And an adjective is something that describes or modifies a noun or a pronoun. And we're going to focus on these four key types: descriptive, quantitative, possessive, and demonstrative. Okay, starting with descriptive. Okay, so descriptive adjectives, typically have to do with characteristics or traits, ways to simply describe, a person, place, or thing. And to break that down even further, we can break descriptive adjectives into two categories: inherent and non-inherent. Although you might not be too familiar with those words, if you read those descriptions, it should be a little bit more clear for you. So an inherent descriptive adjective is one that is native to the noun that it describes. If you think about the sun is hot. There's no questioning that. Okay, if you think about mountains, they're tall, they're high in elevation. If they're not, they're not mountains, they're hills or things of that nature. So in that case, the very uncommon, or the less common of the two, the adjective comes before the noun. And you can see it in those examples. El caliente sol, caliente being the adjective, sol the noun. Alta the adjective, montaña the noun. Doesn't happen quite often, but in this context, in an inherent case, this is the placement rule you must follow. Much more commonly in Spanish, and a little bit unusual in comparison to English, is the placement of a non-inherent descriptive adjective. So this would be a characteristic that does not apply to all nouns of that particular category. So not all men are tall. Not all women are American. Okay. In English, the adjective comes first before the noun, this type. In Spanish, it's the opposite. When you translate it, you want it to sound, logical in English. You don't want to speak backwards, basically. But in Spanish, you must put the noun first before a non-inherent descriptive adjective, as you can see in these two examples. El hombre alto, man. Hombre is the noun. Alto is the adjective, comes after the noun because it is not inherent. And la mujer americana, mujer is the noun. Americana is the adjective. Mujer first. Americana the adjective after it. Again, more often than not, in your program, you're going to be dealing with a lot of non-inherent adjectives, but it is important to remember that the adjective of this type comes after the noun. It modifies. It's very easily confused with English and our placement of adjectives in our language, our native language. Okay, as we move on, we'll talk about quantitative adjectives. A quantitative adjective is one that refers to the quantity or the number, okay, or just quantity or number in general. All right, and they precede nouns in Spanish just like they would in English, meaning they come before the nouns. And something to keep in mind is that numbers can be used as quantitative adjectives as well. So you see a couple of examples down below. 20, the word for 20. 20 shirts, the number 20 can be used as a quantitative adjective, comes before the noun it modifies, never after. And some computers, a word like algunas. All right, also quantitative adjective comes before a word like computadoras. One other common one that's not shown on this slide is probably the word muchos, which you might be familiar with if you were to say something like many shirts or many computers, still before the noun. Muchas camisas, muchas computadoras. So when you think of quantitative, think of quantity, number. Those adjectives come before the nouns they modify. As we move on, our next type of adjective is the possessive adjective. Those, again, that show possession or ownership. And these are always placed before the noun they modify. They precede the noun they modify. They look a little bit like the possessive pronouns, right? Especially in first plural, exactly like them. But first, second, third singular, and third plural are different. And none of these have accents. Some of the pronouns did. Right, in this case, there are no accents on the possessive adjectives. Okay, so you see some words like me and tu and su, etc. Okay, with their English equivalent, English translation next to them. The FAM in second singular just refers back to familiar, which we talked about earlier. And FORM in third person just represents formal, or the non or unfamiliar. Okay, and you see some examples down below. The first one, a very common Spanish expression, which you might be familiar with if you're, trying to be welcoming or hospitable to somebody. The phrase mi casa es su casa. My house is your house. Basically, you're always welcome here. Mi is singular since casa is singular. Su is singular since casa is singular. But as we go down to the second example, all right, in the first one, me and su didn't have any gender. But in the second example, nuestro, or in this case, nuestros, does have gender and number. Since amigos are masculine and plural, nuestros has to agree with that noun in number and gender. And as it says, our friends are very funny. Everything about that sentence that can have gender, nuestros, amigos, and comicos, all agree. Masculine and plural for all of those words. And the verb is plural as well, son. Okay, so keep that placement rule in mind, keep the number and gender agreement rule in mind, and keep those possessive adjectives handy, very commonly used throughout our program. All right, and the last type of adjective that we'll discuss today is the demonstrative. Those that represent, again, location of a noun based on its proximity to the speaker, as we discussed earlier with demonstrative pronouns. Very similar, but just a different part of speech here. Instead of replacing the noun, they will precede the noun. The noun has to be present in this context in order for the demonstrative to be considered an adjective. Same words, the same 12 that you saw on your demonstrative pronoun chart just a few slides back. So if you need to, review them, you can go back and see them listed under demonstrative pronouns. They're the same exact words. The only difference is, like I said earlier, in this case, these demonstratives like esta, ese, and aquellas in your examples have to precede a noun. They cannot be present without a noun immediately after them. So since muchacha is a feminine and singular noun in the first example, esta has to be feminine and singular. So this girl is very pretty. As you go on, you'll recognize that perro, masculine singular, ese agrees with it, masculine and singular. And finally, if you're talking about those women far away, much further than where we are located presently, mujer, as we talked about as one of our examples earlier, means woman. In this case, mujeres, women. Women, feminine noun, aquellas, feminine, demonstrative, adjective, and plural, to agree with mujeres. So just to review there, if you're unsure of what all of the demonstrative adjectives look like, if you simply go back to your list of demonstrative pronouns, they're the same exact words, same exact meanings. The difference is the pronouns replace the noun. In this case, the adjectives rather precede the noun. The noun must be present in this context. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to Zach at this time before we transition into our discussion on adverbs. All right, so to review what you probably already know about an adverb, it's the part of speech that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. Most of the Spanish adverbs end with mente, mente. Not all, but most. Okay, and typically they're placed after a verb, which you can see in example 1 down below. Escribes is the verb, bien is the adverb. Bien is one of the very few that does not end in mente. Or you can place an adverb before an adjective or another adverb, which you can see in examples 2 and 3 down below. Okay, so if you do see a word that ends in mente, it is an adverb, and then some others that are not or do not end in mente, like bien and demasiado and muy, other very common ones, but there aren't that many. Those are probably the three most popular ones. Okay, as we transition, now we will discuss prepositions. Okay, prepositions are words that usually precede a noun or a pronoun and express a relation to another word in the clause. So if you look at that list of common prepositions, take a word like a, the letter A, which means to or at. All right, one of the most common prepositions. In that first example, you see the prepositional phrase a la tienda. Okay, a is the preposition, and it relates to another word in that clause where you're going to be at, or where somebody works at. The store is the other word that it relates to in that clause. Okay, second example, from or since 8 o'clock. 8 meaning the hour is the other word that that preposition refers to in that prepositional phrase. And in that last example, para el examen, the exam is the other word that the preposition represents or relates to in that prepositional phrase. So you just see a few examples of the more common ones. In Spanish, you're going to see a lot of these used in your program. You're going to have to use a lot of them on your written exams, so definitely a good chart to be familiar with as well. And we're going to stay on task with prepositions a little bit and transition to contractions. Right? A contraction that you probably are familiar with in English, words like don't and can't, they're not used. They don't exist in Spanish. Okay. However, as I mentioned earlier, prepositions can be tied in with contractions in Spanish. All right. Words like a and de, two of the more commonly seen prepositions that we had on the previous slide's chart, they can combine with the masculine singular definite article that we talked about much earlier in this webinar, the word el. And when you combine a and el, or de and el, you have created the only two Spanish contractions that do exist. They're different in terms of form and use than the English contractions, but they are indeed considered contractions within the Spanish language. So anytime you want to express to the or at the, when the noun is a masculine singular noun preceded by the article el, you're going to contract a and el to create the word al, as you can see on the bottom left side of this slide. And that example represents that. Fuimos al parque. We went where? To the park. You would never write out the word a and el, or the words a and el back to back when el is an article. Okay, so don't be confused with el, the article, and el, the pronoun, meaning he or him. Okay, the accent makes a big difference. The lack of an accent makes it an article, not a pronoun. And then the only other contraction in Spanish would be the combination of the words de and el, which form del. In each of these two contractions, the first E, basically, or one of the E's, the only E, has been removed. All right, for that second one, leaving only one E. And you can see that in use in that second example. Vinimos del cine. We came, or we just came from the movies, or from the theater. All right, del meaning from the. All right, because cine, just like parque, is a masculine singular noun, and the article that precedes it to say the would be el, as shown in the middle of this slide. So again, this is something that you'll probably be using quite a bit. All right, just try to keep in mind when a or de precedes el as an article, the word that means the, not the word that means he or him, you must contract those two words to form al and del. Okay, and the last part of our preposition discussion would be a brief comparison and contrast between por and para. Generally, these two prepositions mean for, but they do have quite a few different meanings depending on their use, their context. and they are used differently depending on the context. They are not interchangeable in Spanish. Each of them has 4 very specific uses or contexts listed on each side of this chart. And you can read through them as you go through. All right, on the left side, por is used for either a manner or a means, like, the means of transportation, etc. The exchange or the rate of something, maybe currency or miles per hour, just for a few examples. The duration that something lasted for in terms of time, that example in parentheses meaning for 8 hours. And, if something was done with a certain person as the motivation, as you can see in that last example on the bottom left, if I will do something for you, I will do it for you. You are the motivation for me doing whatever it is that favor or that task might be. So for 4 very specific uses for using por in the Spanish language. And then on the right side, 4 very different uses to use the word para. Again, both of them can generally mean for, F-O-R, but they are not interchangeable. So if you have a destination, like if this flight is headed for Madrid, para would be used. All right, if somebody is the recipient of something like a gift, all right, para would be used. So a gift versus like a favor, which is more motivation. When you have a deadline, if you have homework or an assignment or an exam due, para is used. And typically, if you have a goal or a purpose, you're going to see an infinitive verb like ganar, ending in AR, ER, or IR, after the preposition. Typically, para is the one that is used before an infinitive when there's a goal or a purpose in mind. Okay, so these can be a little bit tricky, right? Something to definitely keep in mind as you move forward. If you can break them down into their 4 specific or respective uses, that you see on either side of this chart, then you should be good to go with differentiating between when to use por versus when to use para. Okay, just a couple more slides here, a couple more very brief topics to discuss before we wrap up today's webinar. Something that is a little bit challenging for non-Spanish speakers at first is called the personal a. It's something that we don't use in English, but something that is very important for your Penn Foster Spanish course. When a person is the direct object of a sentence, when you can answer whom somebody sees or knows, as you can see in those 2 examples below, then a form of the preposition, the personal a, is required. So we don't think about it in English because there's nothing like this in the English language. As you can see in that first example, I see my mother. You have your subject, you have your verb, you have your object. Subject I, verb see, my mother being the object. However, since my mother is whom I see, then the personal a is needed in Spanish before that object. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Even though it doesn't have a translation in English, it is absolutely necessary and required in Spanish. And then if the object happens to be a masculine singular person like padre in the second example, if you think about the word like the father, el padre, if I know the father of my friend, as we would say in English more commonly, my friend's father, then you have to contract a and el like we just talked about a couple slides back. Again, the al doesn't have any English translation. You simply go straight from the verb to the object. I know him, meaning my friend's father, but the personal a, or at least this form of the personal a, is absolutely necessary in the Spanish language. You can't leave it out, or else you'll be misspeaking. If it was on a test, you would lose some points for that. So even though it's not used in English, it's something to keep in the forefront of your mind. Definitely important as you progress throughout the program. Okay, and that wraps up our talk on the personal a. All right, our second to last topic is a conjunction, a word that joins words or phrases together, and, or, both, but, etc., as you can see on the chart on the left side there. Okay, one thing to keep in mind, the word y, the letter y in Spanish, it means and, but if you look at that first note on the right side, if it appears before another like sound, meaning if the next word, if you look down below, like Isabella, also has that E sound, then that letter Y changes to an E. So that first example, Pablo e Isabella, would never be expressed as Pablo y Isabella, since the two E sounds cannot follow one another. So that's just an exception to the rule. Same thing goes for the letter O, right? The letter O, meaning or in Spanish, if it appears before another like sound, as you see in that second example, the question about Marta and Oscar. Since Oscar has that O sound, his name, then the letter O has to change to a U. If neither of those, appears before a like sound, keep the letter Y, keep the letter O, as you can tell in that last example. Mi familia y yo, sometimes pronounced Joe, depending on the dialect. All right, the Y doesn't need to change in that context since yo doesn't have an E sound. Even though it starts with the letter Y, it doesn't sound like that before a vowel. Okay, so just a few common conjunctions and two exceptions to the rules for and or, E and O. Definitely something to keep in mind as well. A lot of exceptions in every language, right? Not that many in Spanish, and especially in comparison to the English language, which has a wide variety of irregularities and exceptions. And finally, our last part of speech for today's webinar is an interjection. Simply an exclamation or an abrupt remark. As you can see, four of the more commonly used interjections in Spanish. Trying to get somebody's attention or just simply speaking to them casually, a word like oye, hey, kind of like saying, hey, what's up? Or hey, pay attention to me. All right, and some other ones there that, just something to be mindful of. Not all that common throughout the program, but it's always good to know what an interjection is. All right, so that concludes today's webinar. We thank you sincerely for your attention. We know there was a lot of material covered in today's webinar. You will receive a copy of this, so definitely something to hold, maybe even print off if you'd like. Keep as you progress through your program to use as a valuable resource. If you do have any other questions, feel free to please send those in to Zach, and he'll be happy to answer those for you at this time. I thank you and hope to see you in future webinars. Good luck in your program, and if you need to reach out to us, you may do so with the ways on this slide.